Good afternoon and welcome to the Christian Community Development Association's webinar entitled Set the Prisoners Free. I'm Michelle Warren and I work for CCDA. I'm the Advocacy and Strategic Engagement Director. I want to take this time just to welcome you to this webinar that is going to be put on by Miea Walker and Shawn Casselberry. Before we introduce our presenters, I wanted to let you know that this webinar is a part of a bigger effort. The CCDA Association is a member association of leaders all across the country who are doing Christian community development in vulnerable communities. And as we've been journeying together a little over 30 years, some for the whole time and others are newer to the association, we have recognized that there is systemic injustice that requires that we as Christians confront that injustice. We have three platform issues that we work together as an association on. The three are immigration reform, education equity, and mass incarceration. Every year on the second Thursday of February, we set that day aside in our association and we call it Locked in Solidarity. It's our national advocacy, awareness, and action day around mass incarceration. And that's taking place in 50 cities around the country next Thursday, February 9th. I would invite you to join us if we are in your city, and if not, we would encourage you to register and take some time to create space to learn a little bit more about mass incarceration, to listen to stories of people who are impacted, to take time to pray, we've even used this opportunity to invite police officers and local elected officials into our communities and have conversations, as well as go to our state capitals and city and county buildings to try to really engage the mass incarceration issue and tell how it impacts our communities. So one of the things that we want to do is do a good job to inspire, train, and connect, which is the mission of CCDA. We want to inspire and train and connect our practitioners around the country as they get ready for Locked in Solidarity. And so that's why we're hosting this webinar. And so if you're a part of CCDA, we welcome you. If you are new to CCDA, we also welcome you. And we thank you for taking this hour to be with us as we do this webinar. Before we go ahead, I want to let you know it's going to be a 1-hour presentation. So we will wrap up at 5:30 Eastern Standard Time. We are going to have a Q&A time for the last 10 to 15 minutes. And the way that we're going to moderate that Q&A is through a hashtag on Twitter. I'll actually be checking the Twitter feed, and the hashtag is Set the Prisoners Free. Set the Prisoners Free. So if you have a question, put it out on Twitter, hit that hashtag, and I'll make sure that we bring that to our presenters towards the end. Additionally, on our website, we have at CCDA/prisonersfree. We have access to the PowerPoint. And so please go ahead and go to that part of our website and you'll be able to get the PowerPoint for today. At this point, we're going to have Miea Walker and Shawn Casselberry introduce themselves.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Miea Walker. I am the engagement coordinator for the Second Chance Alliance of the North Carolina Justice Center. I'm also a directly impacted individual, so I'm very passionate about the topic of mass incarceration. At the Justice Center, we are a collective body of justice organizations whose purpose is to advocate for the successful reentry of those directly impacted individuals by promoting policy reform. And so part of my work is to target communities with those individuals that are directly impacted and to ensure that they have the resources and tools to successfully reintegrate, and then also to connect with our local legislators on policy reform.
And I'm Shawn Casselberry, and I'm the Executive Director for Mission Year. And I'm also part of the CCDA Mass Incarceration Task Force. And we're going to share a little bit why were involved in this. I've been with CCDA for 13 years, and after living in a community and immersing myself for 13 years on the west side of Chicago, started to realize I couldn't say I love my neighbor if I'm not also engaged in the systems that are causing them pain. And I started realizing that mass incarceration was a destructive force in the lives of a lot of the kids, the youth, families in our community. And so that kind of started to lead to raising more awareness, started asking questions, getting involved, saying what's happening here with this system, and what's our responsibility as Christians as part of this. Started visiting prisons, and recently did my doctoral work research on mass incarceration and what Christians can be doing. So we're going to share from our experience, but also some things that we've learned along the way in our ministry contexts. Our objectives for this webinar is really to understand the landscape of mass incarceration. So we're going to look at some stats and figures. We're going to look at barriers that returning citizens face. We're going to talk about what is prison really like versus maybe how it's portrayed on TV or what we might think in our minds. We're going to spend some time looking at blind spots and barriers for the church, what keeps the church from being more engaged on this issue. And we're going to look at theological themes for discipling Christian communities. Then we're going to move into strategies of engaging your church and building relationships, tools for action and advocacy, and resources.
So let's talk about the truth about incarceration. Currently, we have over 2.4 million people that are incarcerated in our country, and the Pew reports that this number is going to increase by 3% by 2018. Of the 2.4, Black males in their 30s, 1 in 10 are in prison at any given time. These arrests and convictions are largely due to the war on drugs. And over 1.6 million people who are arrested, prosecuted, incarcerated, and or deported each year is for some type of drug law. So when we're looking at incarceration, we know that this is gender specific to men, and these are the 10 worst states for incarceration of Black men.
This is a chart from the Prison Policy Initiative. It shows kind of the scale of mass incarceration. It's not just one issue. Mass incarceration is a complex system that includes jails, state prisons, federal prisons, and even kids who are caught in the snares of mass incarceration. This chart is really instructive too, because it shows you that a large part of those that are in the system are nonviolent offenders.
So female incarceration, this population is probably one of the most overlooked population in considering mass incarceration. Like I said previously, mass incarceration is typically geared towards men, but however, our numbers for our female population is increasing. Women who are incarcerated for drug offenses are nearly double the rate of men. 2/3 of women in prison are of color, and many of these women have experienced sexual, physical abuse, addiction, mental illness, PTSD, HIV, and AIDS. So we know that we are the world's leader of incarceration, but we're also the world's leader in incarcerating women. So we're going to take some time to look at felony disenfranchisement restrictions by the state. If you, depending on where you are, so for me, it's North Carolina, you can see the different types of restrictions. So the light yellow is no restriction. The deep kind of orange is prison. The light blue is prison and parole. And where I live, which is North Carolina, is prison, parole, and probation. And then the dark gray is the harshest sentence of prison, parole, probation, and post-release. So in terms of our brothers and sisters that are returning home, many of them face financial barriers. So some of them may have back child support that they are required to pay upon release. There are parole fees depending on the state. Here in North Carolina, our parole fees are $40, but depending also the type of crime, you may have to pay some type of treatment. So if there are people that are struggling with any type of mental health or substance abuse issues, they may have to seek treatment. and pay for that treatment that can range for like $160, $175 per assessment, in addition to paying parole fees. And as we know, most of our brothers and sisters coming home, and specifically if they're not at a minimum security prison where they have access to work release, are walking out the doors with no money. And so they are just struggling, trying to figure out, how do we pay these fees? How do they meet the requirements of their probation? This also includes attorney fees and drug fines that are imposed upon them upon their release. The effects of debt, obviously we know that's going to be reduced household income, not just from the individual that obviously may or may not be working, but the family's income as well. Many of our brothers and sisters may be returning home and staying with a loved one, and so their income is going to be reduced by the fines and fees that are attached to them. There's also strained relationships. There may be strained relationships of the individual while they're incarcerated, and so specifically returning home, trying to connect with loved ones and family, and trying to rebuild that relationship, in addition to trying to just figure out how to live post-incarceration. There's also anxiety and stress, and then anxiety and stress that may be imposed upon that as well. 4 in 10 return to prison within 3 years of their release. Some of the psychological factors of post-incarceration, we talked about anxiety and stress of having to meet the obligations of the state, that whatever those fines and fees or obligations that are imposed upon them, but then also there's guilt and anger, suicide, shame, substance use, loss of self-worth, depression. And so these are issues that really contribute to the success of that individual, or the lack of success of the individual when they're coming out of the prison. So let's talk a bit about prison culture, which is what is sometimes classified as an environment of shame. It dehumanizes the individual. I want you to think of someone that's never been in prison, that's never been in trouble, and finds themselves in a prison system and having to adapt to the culture that already exists while they're there. For most people, it re-traumatizes victims of abuse. So for men or women who've experienced some type of trauma as a child and having to be reintroduced to that once they're in prison, then they're re-victimized all over again. The structure of prison influences the behavioral outcomes. It becomes the survival of the fittest. For women that are in prison, it really is whoever the person that's in charge, the person that has taken over that domain, whether it be in the dining room, whether it be in the dorm, whether it's outside on the yard, there's always somebody that is the person that's in control. And so you're having to figure out how to live life in that environment. There's also an imbalance of power of staff versus residents and residents versus residents, trying to figure out a way to live. And so how do I manipulate the system? How do I get over a staff member? How do I befriend a staff member so I can have some sort of type of comfort while I'm incarcerated? There's a loss of self-worth, which leads to assimilation. And then many of our brothers and sisters develop unhealthy coping mechanisms, which will either you're going to retreat or you're going to have self-destruct.
We want to take some time to explore some of the blind spots and barriers for the church. When I was visiting a prison here in Illinois, I was going with a chaplain, and he shared a story with me that was really interesting. He said, you know, a lot of the conservative folks that are involved in prison, they come and visit the prison, they get inside the prison, they do Bible study, evangelism, they get to know the guys, but they don't do much around advocating to change some of the systems. And he said, and a lot of the liberals that he knows are all about advocating for the system, but they never come in the prison. There's blind spots that we have, depending on sometimes our ideological or theological lenses. For conservatives, sometimes that plays out into very individual approach to it takes the form of prison ministry. For those in the liberal camp, kind of takes the form of prison advocacy. And this creates blind spots for both sides. Race is another factor. Sometimes with race, the prison system is very much a racialized system. And whether we're coming from a conservative background or a liberal background, we have some issues around race. Ron Sider talks about how many conservatives are the most likely group to object to having a neighbor that's of a different race than them. But liberals and progressive sounding Christians are the least likely to actually live in a diverse neighborhood or go to a church with diversity. So there's a racial blind spot, no matter where we're kind of coming from around this issue. There's also issue of proximity. I've talked to activists who are involved in around mass incarceration, and no matter what communities that they were working among, they found that whether it was evangelicals or mainline, the big issue is proximity, that people are not close enough to those who are in prison to really hear their stories, to really understand what is happening in the prison. A lot of times with prisons, it's out of sight, out of mind. I want to talk about, there's a couple studies that came out through Lifeway Resources that showed surveys among pastors. And they show that only 46 agree that the rapid growth in recent decades of the inmate population in America is unjust. This means less than half of pastors think there is even a problem with the justice system. They asked, have you personally ever visited a correctional facility? 83% had said yes, but still, even though they had visited a correctional facility, they do not think, less than half of those pastors do not think there's a structural issue or a justice issue. They identified 5 top barriers that churches face in expanding prison ministry. 65% said lack of volunteer leaders. 62% said lack of training for this type of ministry. 48% said lack of finances. 40% said they do not know where to start. And 29% said our church has too many other ministries. I found this number, 40% don't know where to start, is a huge barrier, because it's not that churches aren't interested or don't care, but a lot of them just don't know, what do we do? What do we do about this huge system? And this is really an interesting problem, because we have so many theological resources within Scripture that kind of help us in how we can engage this system. I want to share now 4 themes that kind of stand out through Scripture about God's heart for prisoners. The first is the promise of God's liberation for prisoners. Psalm 146:7 says, he upholds the case of the oppressed and gives food to the hungry. The Lord sets prisoners free. Lee Griffith, in The Fall of the Prison, said the earliest word regarding prisons in the Bible is at once simple and scandalous: liberty for captives. We know that God is a God of liberation, that God liberated the people of Israel out of Egypt and slavery. But as the people of Israel were led into captivity and exile, that promise of liberation for the slave became a promise of liberation for those in prison. And we see in Luke 4 that Jesus revives this promise of liberation when he starts his ministry and says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to proclaim good news to the poor, bind up the brokenhearted, and to set the oppressed free. The next theme is this prophetic confrontation of injustice. The prophets didn't just speak about injustice in a general sense. It was very specific. They spoke to specific social realities that were happening at the time, whether it was widows who were being driven off their land or orphans who were being taken advantage of, exploited. They spoke about very specific cases of injustice that impacted their communities. Amos says here, I am the Lord, and I know your terrible sins. You cheat honest people and you take their bribes. You rob the poor of justice. Seek good and not evil, that you may live. And thus may the Lord God of hosts be with you, just as you have said. Hate evil, love good, and establish justice in the gate. The gate was the courtroom, the court system of their day. That the poor were being taken advantage of. They didn't have the money to bribe the judges, so they didn't have the same chance at justice as those that had money. But Amos said this is not right, and speaking for God says God doesn't want just your religious expression. He wants justice to roll down like water, righteousness like a never-ending stream. The third stream is the restorative nature of God's mercy. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. I remember visiting a prison and talking to men who were serving life sentences, and we were talking about scripture, and one of the guys said, Cain, Moses, and Paul were all murderers, but how did God treat them? He restored them. But there's no restoration in the justice system. That was his lament. Christians, we should be the most merciful people on the planet, but yet a lot of times we're the most punitive. Some of the states with the highest executions of prisoners are states that have the highest concentration of Christians. Our prison system is often a system of retribution and not restoration, but God is a God of mercy, and God restores. This last theme is solidarity, the solidarity of Jesus and the early church with the prisoner. We know that Jesus himself was a prisoner. Every Sunday when we go to church and we worship and we lift Jesus up, we are worshiping a death row prisoner who was executed by the state, was falsely and innocently executed. Jesus stood with those who are in prison. He literally stood with those on the cross. Not only that, he called the church to stand with those in prison as well. In Matthew 25, he says, I was in prison and you visited me. In Hebrews 13:3, it says, continue to remember those in prison as if you were together with them in prison, and those who are mistreated as if you yourselves were suffering. The early church took this so seriously that when one of their brothers and sisters were incarcerated, they did everything they could to advocate to set them free. And if they couldn't, they would bribe the guards so that they could sleep in the cells with their brothers and sisters. Solidarity is how we can be church to those who are in prison.
So let's talk about some strategies to overcome barriers to reentry. So relationships, right? Relationships are very important. And the one thing that always, I think people often overlook is that Jesus was a relational God and is a relational God, right? So the main thing we need to do is work on building community. We need to cultivate change, create safety for our brothers and sisters that are returning home, and displays Christ's love. So in building genuine relationships, what's the first thing we need to do? Be a friend. That's all. It's just very basic. Be a friend. Be patient. And what I mean by that is don't impose what you think is right or wrong onto our brothers and sisters. You represent the heart of Christ, and you reflect that in your engagement with that individual. So in walking life with them, you have to listen to them. You have to be patient. You have to respect where they are. But in reflecting that Christ love, that's when the change and the aha moment happens. So you can't impose like what your ideas or your perception of what they should or should not do. Just simply be a friend. Respect them, respect where they are, respect their situation and what they're going through. And then also be consistent and reliable. And what I mean by that, for many of you that are doing prison ministry, that are going inside, please be consistent and reliable. One of the most hurtful and shameful things is having a connection with someone and that person is so excited to see you, and then all of a sudden you just drop off the face of the earth. Like the letters stop, the visits stop, and it's very painful because the shame is then they internalize that as, what have I done? I must have done something wrong. I must be a bad person. And so just be very consistent in your relationship and try not to impose any expectations upon that individual. This is a question I ask a lot when I'm giving presentations, and Do you see me? And I want you to stop and think about what that means. I want you to stop and think about, for people who are marginalized and oppressed and disenfranchised, I want you to think about and specifically tie that into what's happening today, what's happened in the past couple of days for our Muslim brothers and sisters. Do you see me? Do you see me apart from my crime? Do you see me apart from my poor choices? Do you see me as an individual? Do you see me through the eyes of Jesus? Because one of the things I noticed is that, you know, there's so much uproar about banning our brothers and sisters, and it's hard. I mean, it's just painful, it's excruciating. But I want you to think about those that are incarcerated. They're refugees as well. And I say that because when you're returning home, you're seeking refuge of the community that you're returning to. And when we're coming home, the door is shut. When we're coming home and we're excited to go home, we're excited that we're able to connect with our family. We're so excited because now we're like, yes, I can get a job and I can take care of my kids and I can reconnect. And every door is slammed. Every door says no. There's no opportunity. We don't want you here. And we see that currently right now. So I'm asking you today, do you see us? Are you willing to walk life with us? Are you willing to just step into that sacred space and be present and to hear our pain and say that I'm with you and I'm with you, I stand with you and I love you and I see you.
I wanted to share a couple recent victories in criminal justice reform. Sometimes when you're engaging mass incarceration or any kind of big system, it's easy to get overwhelmed. There has been some progress over the last few years that we've seen. There's a solitary confinement was banned for juveniles in federal prison in 2016. 6,000 nonviolent federal prisoners were released in 2015. Virginia restored voting rights to formerly incarcerated citizens. The governor at the time put a law through for 200,000, but the courts ended up overturning that. But he was still able to restore the rights for 140,000. The Department of Justice vowed that they would end private prisons in 5 years. And there's been a renewed evangelical interest in ending the death penalty. I was in DC recently with a group of evangelicals who were giving witness to the death penalty to stop executions and stand with those who are on death row. But these victories are not always set. You always have to fight. It's a continual struggle. Some of the things that the progress that's been made, there's also the potential for it to go backwards if we're not continuing to work and fight for justice.
So how do we engage the church? When most people come to me and say, you know, Miea, I'm interested in prison ministry, what do I need to do first? The first thing I always say is understand the landscape of mass incarceration. What are the challenges and issues? Start reading Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow or Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. Get an understanding of how we got here as a country to help better drive your passion and inform the decisions that you make as you're working with our brothers and sisters who are incarcerated. Another thing is analyzing the talents and gifts and skills of your congregation. My congregation here in North Carolina, we have 3,000 to 5,000 members. And so I always tell people, like, if you have 150 or if you have 2,000, it's 2,000 resources, it's 2,000 access to jobs. And so take time to sit down with your prison ministry team or the pastor of your church or your ministry leader and say, you know, I'm very interested in diving in this issue. What are some things that we can do to be supportive of our brothers and sisters when they're coming home? Develop a support team to monitor and support and supervise volunteers. Many prisons obviously require people to have, we're here in North Carolina, we have a blue card that allows you to go in. And so whatever paperwork that needs to be done, there's going to be paperwork, there's going to be a background check. So make sure that you have a team support you, a prayer circle, those individuals that can support you while you're there, and obviously support and pray for our brothers and sisters too. Identify resources available in your community. Most states have local resource guides in your area, so you can look and see what available agencies are there to provide resources, such as our substance use facilities and healthcare services. And then create an inclusive environment. And what we mean by that is an inclusive environment for those that are coming out, inclusive environment, which means your congregation, the individual, for the individual and their families. And then lastly, and most importantly, before you even start that, seek prayer, seek God's face and what he's really called you to do. Not many people are called to actually go inside and serve. There could be many things that you could do on the outside, but just seek the guidance of the Lord of what he has placed on your heart.
We're living in a very polarized time where I think all of us are kind of wrestling with how do we kind of come together as a church. One of the ways that we can help our congregation is to identify some of our blind spots, identify that we talked about earlier. Help your church saying, you know, we do a lot of prison ministry, but are we doing prison advocacy too? Or if you're involved with a church that's very much activist or doing advocacy, say, why don't we go into the prisons? Why don't we help those who are returning home from prison? So help your pastor too. If your pastor may be like, I don't really see this as an issue, help your pastor understand this. Show them the scriptures that are there. Make mass incarceration an organizational and church commitment. I was so proud of CCDA for coming out and saying, we're going to stand and we're going to make mass incarceration one of our top 3 justice issues. We've been trying to do the same thing with our organization. You could do that in your church or your community. Host a Locked in Solidarity event or host a film festival. CCDA has great resources. Locked in Solidarity is one. So excited that we have over 50 cities that are going to be doing Locked in Solidarity. It's a great way for us to be the church, to show how do we really stand with our brothers and sisters. We also have a film festival that CCDA does and can bring that to your city. We need to make legislative advocacy. We need to see it as a spiritual discipline and practice it regularly. Sometimes calling, your congressman or going visiting it, it doesn't always seem like, is this really making a difference? Is this really working? But we've heard from so many congressmen who say, we don't do anything unless we're hearing from our constituencies and that they care about this. So if you're a church and you have 100, 200 people and you are making calls, that will make an impact and a difference. So make your voice be heard. I remember when I was in prison, I was talking to some of the guys in there, and I was asking, like, what would you like to see the church do? What can we do? And they said, get involved in politics. Like a lot of the injustices around are policies that are tough on crime, or politicians that use tough on crime language to get votes. So they play on people's fears. He said, stop voting for tough on crime politicians and seek more restorative measures. And then incorporate advocacy resources into everything we do, our Bible studies, sermons, discipleship curriculum. Advocacy is a real way to empower our congregation to take action and to do something. If we're just focusing on personal development, we may not always get to attack some of these systemic issues.
So here's just a couple of resources that have provided the information for this presentation. And if you're looking for additional resources, we have that on CCDA's website as well. So lastly, we want to conclude with this theological response is moving from brokenness to flourishing. Ultimately, the church must seek new approaches that understands crime as a threat to community, not just a violation of law, that demands new efforts to rebuild lives, not just build more prisons, and that demonstrate a commitment to reweave a broader social fabric of respect for life, civility, responsibility, and reconciliation. Rather than supporting a system that merely punishes, The church must pursue a justice system that builds community and seek God's shalom.
Michelle Alexander said, nothing short of a major social movement is needed or will cause this issue of mass incarceration to change. Miea has said before, we need advocacy, we need solidarity, but we need a move of God. And so I think our prayers, our action, our calling, our congressman, we're going to need all of these things to bring change around this issue. But I'm very encouraged by the CCDA, by the Elect in Solidarity, by churches around the country that we talk to. People care about this and want to get involved. So we're going to take some questions now, and would love to hear from people. Like, what are you longing to know? What are some of the questions on your heart as you think about this issue of mass incarceration and how it's impacting your community?
Well, Shawn and Miea, I want to thank you for doing this presentation and for being willing to take questions. For those of you who may be listening and want to send a question, please feel free to put it out on Twitter with the hashtag #SetThePrisonersFree. I know many people don't have Twitter, and so I know that can be limiting. But for those of you who do, please send it through that hashtag. Shawn and Miea, one of the questions that is being asked is, do you know of any communities or any church communities or nonprofits either within CCDA or not in CCDA that are engaging this in a way that we could model our behavior after that? And maybe there's pieces to different places, but do you have some models in communities that we could follow?
Miea, do you want to answer that first?
I probably should. Yeah. I mean, I'm sorry. As I was listening to the silence, I was like, well, I probably didn't ask anybody specific. I would love to hear both of your response, but Miea, if you've got something first, and maybe then Shawn.
I was thinking of Healing Communities USA that have a really great platform, and for some reason the guy's name, oh yes it is, sorry, Dr. Harold Dean Trulier in DC. He's the executive director of that organization, and I use a lot of his resources from his website. They're available to download. He has created a toolkit for various purposes and things specific to incarceration. There's a mentoring platform. There's like advocacy and how to engage your community and educating people on mass incarceration. There's another one that's specific to children of incarcerated parents and the juvenile justice system. So I would definitely Google that. It's called Healing Communities USA. And then once you get there, you can click, they have a tab that's labeled resources, and they have a ton of resources that are exclusive to what we presented today.
Yeah, I've seen a number of different models. Whenever we're talking, and doing this workshop, we always have so many people that come up and are sharing different ways of what their churches are doing. And I don't think there's not one way to do it. There's not one strategy. I think, some churches are writing letters to those in prison, and we've heard that that just brings so much encouragement for those that are inside. I think thinking about it is, how do we do preventative work? There's organizations that do preventative work. How do we keep people from getting into the pipeline? And then there's organizations that are doing work while people are inside. How are we making sure that we're showing up with them, letting them know that they're loved and cared for? How are we making sure that there's education being offered in the prison? One of the chaplains that I talked to says, we get offers all the time for churches to do Bible studies in prison, but we hardly ever get classes on life skills, on how do you survive once you get out. And so I would say, if you have people within your church that have different practical skills, specific gifts, like go into the prison and offer, like, could you use skill, could you use a class around resume building? Could you use a class around, urban farming? You could use a class around, all these different things that you may think like is not necessarily ministry, but it is, because it's helping folks that are in there get a holistic range of services. And then there's those that are doing work once our brothers and sisters get out of prison. And that's one of the big things. Some of the guys at the place where I visit, they said, you know what, these Christians love to come in here and do the worship service in the prison. They love to come and talk to us. But then when we get out, they don't want us to come into their churches. They're afraid of us. So part of it is how do we welcome folks once they get out of prison? How do we help them with resources like housing and employment and other things like that? So there's a lot of different ways and places, I think, that the church can fill in the gaps.
I would also say reach out to, if you're interested in just learning the basics or just trying to get your feet wet. That God has called you, but you're just not sure where to go. You can actually reach out to the local chaplains and just say, hey, I'm interested in this issue. What are some of the gaps? Like, what are the things that are lacking inside the prison? What can we do? And then go from there. Because then you really get a in-depth overview of what's happening in that specific prison and what their needs are. And then you can take it back to your Bible study group or your church or pastor or ministry leader and say, here's something that's near and dear to our heart. I think that we need to see how we can become a part of this.
That's good. Thanks, Miea. I would say probably, or even just a little bit of a piggyback question on what you just mentioned has come in. And that is, somebody was asking, how would they even set up any type of small group? The question specifically says, or the comment is, I want to engage prisoners in a small group setting, and I'm new to all of it. Is it even possible in most prisons? The reason Miea, I don't know if you were able to take this, but you had made a comment just earlier that just to call the chaplain for people who are new to this, how would we even go about that and then move forward to even have some type of group in a prison to begin a small group?
I think most, and I'll speak exclusively to North Carolina, most of our local prison ministries started within the church of an idea of like, you know what, why don't we reach out to the prisoner community? And someone just went on the website of Department of Public Safety here in North Carolina and contacted the Director of Rehabilitative Services to find out, and that same person's over programming, to find out how they could make that introduction from their church to the actual chaplain. I will tell you that chaplains are very, very, very excited to receive any type of help because it's overwhelming right now. I mean, a lot of funding for our prisons have been cut, so it's impacted programming yes, typically we are required to provide those that don't have a GED, but I remember a couple of years ago, the GED funding was cut here in our state. So opportunities to be able to get in that way and start with just a simple Bible study of being able to sit down and meet with a chaplain, meet with the superintendent of that prison and say, here's what my church can do. Can we participate? Most churches are really, will start out that way. And I will tell you, most prisons are very excited. They're very excited to be able to have the resources because they don't have the money to do that anymore. For me, I was able to receive my bachelor's degree while I was incarcerated, but shortly after, and I would say I finished in 2009, and shortly after that, the state of North Carolina cut the funding. So I was the last person to get a 4-year degree, and I was the last person to take advantage of the study release program. So, funding is short. It's just, they make it just to hear the bare necessities. And so being able to provide that support for our brothers and sisters in Bible studies or providing them books that they can read to be able to expand their knowledge behind what they're receiving behind the walls is great. And I will say the biggest thing is just companionship. Being able to see somebody that's different from them and being able to just love and accept them right where they are. So I would start with going to the prison website and reaching out to the chaplain, and then, or if you know someone in your community that already has a connection that would be the best way to get in.
Okay. Shawn, I don't know if you have any comments on that, but let me go ahead and put out the next question, and you can either touch on that or maybe address the new one. But regarding job placements after leaving prison, what skills or connections are most helpful for these individuals?
Yeah, I'll touch on the first one and then get into the next one. Like Miea said, a lot of times it's talking to a chaplain. It depends on how open the chaplain is or not. If they allow you in, I know a lot of colleges are now having classes inside the prison, doing inside out classes, what they call them. So there's ways to kind of get in through there. A lot of chaplains have already a strategy for the skills that they think are necessary for folks as they come out. I mean, one of the issues that it really highlights around jobs is many people coming out of prison have records, right? And that's a permanent barrier. And a lot of this, some CCDA ministries have been working around the banning the box, because a lot of folks have to, you're obligated to fill out if you've been in prison before, and that is a barrier to employment. So one of the biggest things to help folks as they're coming out of prison is banning the box and finding ways to allow folks to get their records expunged, and so that it doesn't provide a barrier. I don't know if you want to talk more about some of the specific skills that you think.
Yeah, for here at the Justice Center, we just hosted our expunction clinic in November, and so what started out as 2,000 people ended up being 200 people with their records expunged, which obviously is a very small number because many people don't qualify, and each state has their own set of rules and regulations as to per statute of what's considered expungible or not. But we advocate on those efforts, and we also advocate for expanding the certificate of relief, which is not an expungement, but it's an opportunity to be able to get that in front of an employer and being able to say, like, these lower level felonies have been classified as certificate of relief. This is to certify that I am not a threat and I'm able to find full-time employment. One of the things that's missing is, like, I would say and I always tell most of our people who are going in, who are becoming mentors or doing prison ministry, is helping them to write their resume, helping them to really be able to articulate what their needs are and what their skill set is beyond the GED. And touching on what Shawn said, there are a lot of colleges that are doing prison classes or hosting classes that are going inside. I know that here in North Carolina, we actually have a divinity program where our brothers and sisters actually leave the facility and go to campus and pursue that certificate. So there's different things that can happen, but we have to really work. We have to be very intentional in making sure, because that's not an access or a resource that's open to everybody.
Thanks. So just to let everybody know, I don't know where you joined us in the part of this webinar, but Miea and Shawn's slides are available if you go to ccda.org/prisonersfree, which is where you're probably viewing the webinar right now. Right above the screen has a place for you to put your name. It has a place for you to put your email, and you just hit return after you've done that. Then we'll be able to find out your information and send you the slides. So just wanted to put that out there. Just another question that has come in has to do with the resources. And so I'm wondering, Shawn, if for some of this time you could click back to the slide that you and Miea, yeah, there we go with some resources. I know there was a question of what were some additional resources beyond just Mercy and the new Jim Crow. I know you've got a few there. I'll just take this opportunity to tell everybody that we have a resource section for mass incarceration under the Biblical Justice tab. So if you go on the ccda.org website and you click Biblical Justice and you click mass incarceration, there's a resource section that you can click on and you'll be able to see a really large amount of resources. I don't know if either of you would like to take the time maybe to talk about a resource. I know, Miea, you talked about Dr. Trulaire's Healing Communities, which is really wonderful. And I do encourage people to check out their website and just the toolkit they've created and how they really have partnered with churches to help those who are in their congregations that are incarcerated as they, in prevention and reentry, and they also include advocacy as well. So I don't know if there's other resources that either of you would like to share that maybe have come to mind that may not be listed here.
Yeah, I have a few. There's a book, I think this would be a great small group book. It's called The Convict Christ, What the Gospel Says About Criminal Justice. And, where Michelle Alexander's book is great. It's very academic. It can be kind of heavy. There's the documentary 13th kind of is a visual form of Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. And then I think Brian Stevenson's book is very accessible, very much narrative. More and more people are reading it, and I think that's a fabulous book. But neither of those books talk about it from a theological perspective, which I think can sometimes be harder for churches to say, well, how does this directly connect with the gospel? How does this connect with my faith? The Convict Christ does that really well. So I would recommend that as a resource.
And who's the author again? The Convict Christ by, who is it?
It's Jens, Jens Soering, Soering.
Thanks. Miea, do you have any other resources that you might have thought of?
I don't. Most of my resources are from the websites that you've seen here. There are a lot of just extensive research on the specific issue.
Yeah.
I definitely would recommend what Shawn said about the Convict of Christ. And there's other, aside from Dr. Trulier, I'm not sure of any other work that's out there at the moment.
Yeah.
We forgot
about pointed out.
We forgot about urban entry, the urban entry video.
Oh my goodness.
Oh my
Shame
gosh.
on all of us. So Shawn, do you want to tell us about urban entry? Definitely a misstep on our part, or my part.
Oh, so sorry.
No, Michelle, if you want to tell a little bit about it, because I know you were very influential in organizing that. But
yes,
Urban Entry, they have videos for churches that really address different topics, and CCDA was able to have a hand in putting one out about mass incarceration. Yeah, Michelle, do you want to tell a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Scott Lundeen is the producer of Urban Entry, and if you go to urbanentry.org, you'll see the whole series, but his sixth, and what he says is his final, we'll see, but right now it's his final one that he created was called Remembering Prisoners, and we're excited about it because CCDA, and then I don't know if you are familiar with Mike McBride and Live Free. He works with the PICO network, so it's a combination of CCDA, Live Free, and Urban Entry coming together to put together a resource. So the video is about 15 minutes, 12 to 15 minutes. I'm not exactly sure the exact time, but just short enough that you can have good conversation afterwards, but just long enough that you can dive into how a church should engage the issue of mass incarceration. There's theology in there, but there's also a lot of good factual data, a lot of stories and different aspects. I know Miea talked a little bit about women, but there's a piece on juvenile justice. Just there's a lot. When we talk about mass incarceration, there's certainly, a lot to be talked about, and I think they do a great job. So that video is there, and Shawn and Miea help contribute to pieces of it, whether through video or also there's a corresponding discussion guide and theological focus sheet for that. So I would encourage you to go to urbanentry.org, and you can get a downloadable copy or you can buy the DVD. One of the other questions that has come in is just a real practical, well, one is a suggestion, so I'm going to list that. And then there's just a question on how to engage vulnerable relationship with not being, I'll just say this, that one of the questions that came in was, I'm writing to prisoners and I want to know, is there things that I shouldn't be putting in there? That's just a very practical question. And then before either of you answer that question, there was a great comment that was made, and that is how exciting it would be to put together business owners in a network within churches, so that when people are re-entering. So I don't know if happening or if that's something we can dream about even at CCDA, and maybe take this person's suggestion, or he can lead it himself. But I think that's some of the resources, Miea, that you were speaking to, that we have resources in our church. And if we would allow people to see themselves, maybe not everybody feels comfortable like leading a Bible study or talking that, but they are comfortable, meeting other businessmen and business people and looking for opportunities to engage people. So what's good to write, and what should we leave out in the letter? And then any comments you might have about not just the business network, but maybe some other creative things that may have popped up during this time.
I think for the letter is just to be very transparent and honest, but also to not put too much personal detail, especially as you're just getting ready to know that individual. And you can guide your response based off of what you hear them say in their response to you. The great thing is just building rapport with each other, and that grows over time, because you as the person that's initiating will get to see what life is like, as I'm pretty sure the person is going to tell you. I wouldn't ask too many personal questions, and then be careful that you have that same respect for yourself. But to just, think of this person as just an individual that God has laid on your heart to reach out to and to love, and create those boundaries in that space, and then let it evolve over time. And it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. I think Jesus said, be wise as serpents and innocent as doves, right? So I think that gives you kind of a, be smart, but your biggest thing is you want to just be encouraging. Don't make promises, don't, that kind of thing. And I think just try to encourage that person as much as you can. One thing that is really helpful, it's a small thing. It goes a long way. This is something I got from Miea, is, I don't know if you notice, if you listen to this presentation, every time she talks about people who are in prison, she talks about them as brothers and sisters. And I think it's a small thing, but instead of saying, a lot of times you see convicts or prisoners or inmates, but as we refer to them as brothers and sisters, it kind of changes how we see them, how we think about them. It's a small thing, but I think that can go just a big way as we're talking about them. And then I just say, I love the idea about the business owners. And
Yes.
I think anytime we can bring people together and create networks, create resources, come alongside folks that may need those, that's huge. That's huge. If you own a business, think about hiring, don't let someone's past determine their future, because we know that God doesn't hold our past against us. We have all had records, and our records have been wiped clean, and God has called us for different tasks. So if we could do that same thing in our business practices, that would be amazing.
I just quickly want to.
Well, thank you. Oh, I was going to say, we're going to get ready to wrap up. Miea, I'll give you the last word, but, just want to encourage everybody to check out ccda.org, check out Locked in Solidarity. If there's an event going on in your city, join, reach out to the person who's coordinating it. If there isn't something happening, please don't put huge pressure that you have to do an enormous event with hundreds of people, but creating any type of space, whether it's in a small group or last year, somebody stopped a basketball practice to have time to, really talk about it. So just be creative and continue to allow these conversations to take place in our community, because that's the way it's going to promote change in both the system and in the way that we view each other. So Miea, why don't you close us out with your statement, and then we will conclude our time together.
I just wanted to piggyback off of Shawn, and I'm so grateful that you said that, because normally, Shawn, when we do presentations together, I always talk about language. yes, I think the most important thing is really seeing our brothers and sisters as people. And so I would highly recommend refraining from calling people ex-offender, former offender, convicts, criminal. If we want them to be empowered and to be able to take the lead as they're coming out of the door and feeling empowered, then it starts with how we view them as human beings and as people.
Very good. Well, with that, thank you so much, Miea. Thank you, Shawn. Thank you for taking the time to valuable time with us and share your expertise, and appreciate that. And thank you everybody else for joining us as well. This concludes our broadcast of Set the Prisoners Free.